The heat radiating off the wooden platform of the depot was enough to warp the air, turning the horizon into a shimmering, watery blur that stung the eyes. Colt adjusted the brim of his hat, squinting against the relentless midsummer glare. He could feel the sweat trickling down the center of his back, soaking into his shirt, but he didn't move. He stood with the stillness of a man who had spent a lifetime hunting, or being hunted, his boots planted firmly in the dust that coated every surface of the small frontier town. In his vest pocket, folded into a tight square, was a letter he had memorized 3 weeks ago. It was a correspondence that promised a different kind of life, a life of quiet mornings, shared coffee, and the softness of a woman's touch to balance the harsh, unforgiving reality of the ranch he had built from nothing. He was waiting for a woman named Emily, a dressmaker from the East who had written about needing a fresh start just as much as he needed someone to come home to. The whistle of the train cut through the thick, oppressive silence, a high-pitched scream of steam and metal that signaled the end of his solitude. The iron beast ground to a halt, hissing like a dying dragon, and passengers began to spill out. Colt watched them, his heart hammering a slow, heavy rhythm against his ribs. He looked for a bonnet, a floral dress, a nervous glance. He saw a merchant with a carpet bag, a family of 4 looking bewildered by the dust, and a few ranch hands returning from the city. But the crowd thinned, and the platform cleared, leaving only the station master checking his pocket watch. Colt took a step forward, confusion knitting his brow, when the final passenger stepped down from the rear car. It wasn't a dressmaker. It wasn't Emily. The figure that landed in the dust with a heavy, confident thud was a woman, but she looked nothing like the picture in his mind. She was Chinese, her features sharp and striking, her eyes scanning the perimeter with the tactical precision of a predator assessing a new hunting ground. She wore no lace, no cotton skirts. She was dressed in stark, dusty black from head to toe, a black button-down shirt tucked into black men's trousers, cinched with a gun belt that hung low on her hips. A black cowboy hat shadowed her face, pulled low, but not low enough to hide the intelligent, dangerous glint in her eyes. Colt stopped dead, his hand instinctively drifting toward his own hip before he caught himself. The woman didn't flinch. She adjusted the heavy rucksack on her shoulder and walked straight toward him, her boots crunching on the gravel. She stopped 3 feet away, close enough for him to smell the scent of gun oil and stale train smoke clinging to her clothes. She looked him up and down, noting the calluses on his hands and the way he stood. "You're Colt," she said, her voice raspy, lacking the delicate cadence he had expected. It wasn't a question. "The buckboard out back is yours." Colt stared at her, the letter in his pocket suddenly feeling heavy as lead. "I'm waiting for a woman named Emily," he said, his voice dropping to a gravelly low that usually made men step back. "She's not coming," the woman in black said flatly. "I'm May, and we need to leave. Now." Colt didn't move. The world had tilted on its axis in the span of 30 seconds. He looked past her, toward the empty train car, seeking a reason, a lie, anything that made sense. "What did you do to her?" he demanded, the threat rising in his throat like bile. May didn't back down. She stepped closer, invading his personal space, her voice dropping to a harsh whisper. "I didn't do anything to her. She sold me her ticket because she got cold feet about marrying a stranger in the middle of nowhere. She's safe back east, but if you keep standing here asking stupid questions, neither of us is going to be safe." Her eyes flicked toward the horizon, back the way the train had come. Colt saw the tension in her jaw, the way her hand hovered near the iron on her hip. This wasn't a negotiation. It was a directive. He looked at the town, the sleepy facade hiding the fact that violence was a currency out here. If she was running, and she had taken his intended bride's place, he was already involved. He could walk away, tell the sheriff, and wash his hands of it. But there was something in her eyes, not fear, but a fierce, desperate survival instinct that mirrored his own. He cursed under his breath, a sharp exhale of frustration. "The wagon is this way," he said, turning on his heel. He didn't offer to carry her bag. She didn't ask. The ride out of town was suffocating, the silence between them thicker than the dust kicked up by the wagon wheels. The summer heat beat down on them, relentless and cruel, baking the earth into a hard, cracked mosaic. Colt kept the horses at a steady trot, his eyes fixed on the trail ahead, but his awareness was entirely on the woman sitting next to him. May sat with a straight spine, her body swaying rhythmically with the movement of the wagon, her eyes constantly moving. She watched the ridge lines, the clusters of scrub brush, the shadows of the rocks. She was a soldier in enemy territory, not a bride coming home. Colt's grip on the leather reins was tight, his knuckles white. He felt like a fool, lured by the promise of domestic peace into a trap he hadn't seen coming. "You're wanted," Colt said eventually, the words cutting through the dry air. It wasn't a question. Innocent women didn't dress in black tactical gear and watch the horizon for pursuit. May didn't look at him. She kept her gaze on a distant cluster of mesquite. "There are men who think I owe them something," she said, her tone evasive. "Is that what they call it now? Owing?" Colt scoffed, shaking his head. "You tricked me. You used a good woman's name to get a free ride out of the city." "I paid her for the ticket," May corrected sharply, finally turning to look at him. "And I didn't trick you? I'm here. I'm the one sitting on this wagon. You wanted a partner for this hard country? Well, you got one. Maybe not the one you ordered from a catalog, but the one who can actually help you survive it." Colt looked at her then, really looked at her. He saw the faint scar running along her jawline, the way her hands were rough, not soft. She was right about the country. It chewed up the soft and spat them out. But that didn't make this right. "I don't need a hired gun, May. I need peace." "Peace is a lie," she said quietly, turning back to the road. "There's just the quiet between the fights." The cynicism in her voice was old, ancient even. It resonated with a part of him he tried to suppress. Before he could respond, May stiffened. She sat up straighter, her hand instantly going to the revolver at her hip. "Dust," she said, pointing to the south. Colt followed her gaze. A few miles back, rising against the blue sky, was a telltale plume of brown dust. Too fast for a carriage, too coordinated for wild horses. Riders, hard riders. Colt felt a cold knot form in his stomach. The reality of his choice to let her in the wagon was crashing down on him. "Law?" he asked. May pulled the black cowboy hat lower. Worse. The transition from tension to chaos happened in the blink of an eye. The distant rumble of hoofbeats grew into a roar, a thunder that vibrated through the wood of the wagon seat. Colt snapped the reins, urging his team into a gallop, the wagon lurching violently as they hit the uneven ground of the canyon floor. "Get down," he shouted, but May was already moving. She didn't cower in the footwell. Instead, she climbed over the seat into the bed of the wagon, using the wooden sideboards for cover. She moved with a fluid grace that spoke of practice, balancing perfectly despite the jarring bumps. Colt risked a glance backward. 5 riders. They were closing the gap, their horses frothed and driven hard. A gunshot cracked the air, a dry pop that sounded harmless until splinters of wood exploded from the wagon frame inches from Colt's shoulder. The horses screamed, panicking, and Colt fought the reins, his biceps straining to keep them on the trail. "Steady," he roared, more to himself than the animals. Another shot whined past his ear. He reached for his rifle in the scabbard by his knee, but driving a team at full gallop with one hand was a suicide mission. Then he heard it, the answering fire. It was rhythmic, controlled. Bang, bang, bang. May was prone in the back of the wagon, her black-clad form blending into the shadows of the cargo, her weapon braced on a sack of grain. She wasn't firing wildly. She was taking her time, breathing between the chaos. Colt saw the lead rider jerk violently backward, flailing as his horse veered off the path. One down. "Keep them steady, Colt," she yelled over the wind, her voice piercing the din. "I can't hit them if we're airborne." Colt grit his teeth, wrestling the wagon around a sharp bend of red rock. The ambush point was ahead, a narrow choke point where the canyon walls closed in. If they could make it there, the riders couldn't flank them. "Hold on!" he shouted. He lashed the reins, the wagon careening on 2 wheels for a terrifying second before slamming back down. More bullets pinged off the metal banding of the wheels. May didn't flinch. She fired again, and another rider's horse stumbled, sending the man tumbling into the dirt in a cloud of dust. Colt felt a surge of reluctant admiration. She wasn't just armed, she was elite. She shot better than half the deputies he knew. They hit the choke point, the walls rising high and jagged around them. Colt hauled back on the reins, bringing the heaving horses to a sliding stop behind a massive fallen boulder that blocked the path. "Out! We make a stand here," he commanded, grabbing his rifle. He didn't have to tell her twice. May vaulted over the side, landing in a crouch, her gun already trained on the bend they had just rounded. They scrambled up the scree slope to a vantage point among the rocks, the heat radiating off the stone, burning through their clothes. Below, the remaining 3 riders slowed, wary of the silence. Colt shouldered his rifle, sighting down the barrel. He glanced at May. She was calm, wiping sweat from her brow with a black sleeve, checking the cylinder of her revolver. Her breathing was steady. She looked at him, and for a second the mask slipped. He saw the adrenaline, the fear controlled by will. "You shoot right, I shoot left," she whispered. It was the first time they had truly agreed on anything. The silence that followed the gunfire was heavier than the noise had been. The canyon was still, save for the heavy breathing of the horses below and the ringing in Colt's ears. The remaining riders had turned back, realizing the tactical disadvantage of charging a fortified position held by 2 shooters who didn't miss. Colt lowered his rifle, the barrel hot against his palm. He looked at May. She was sitting with her back against the red rock, her black hat on the ground beside her, reloading her revolver with methodical precision. Her hands were shaking slightly, just a tremor, but she hit it well. Colt slid down the rocks to check the horses, his mind racing. He had expected a wife to cook dinner. He had ended up with a gunfighter who had just helped him kill 2 men. He walked back up to her, offering her a canteen of warm water. She took it, nodding a silent thanks, and drank deeply, water spilling down her chin onto the dusty black collar of her shirt. "You handle a gun like you were born with it," Colt said, his voice low. It wasn't a compliment, exactly. It was an observation of a tragedy. No woman should have to shoot that well. May wiped her mouth with the back of her hand. "I wasn't born with it. I learned it when I realized the world doesn't care if you're polite." She looked up at him, her dark eyes searching his face for judgment. "Those men, they aren't lawmen. They're hired guns for the railroad company, the syndicate." Colt crouched down, balancing on the balls of his feet. "Why is the syndicate chasing a mail-order bride?" May let out a short, bitter laugh. "I was never a bride, Colt. I was an accountant for them. I saw the ledgers. I saw how they were stealing land, burning farms, paying off judges. I took the books. That's what's in my bag. Not a trousseau. Evidence." Colt stared at her, the pieces clicking into place. The desperation, the skill, the secrecy. She wasn't just running from a crime. She was carrying the weight of a war. He looked at the rucksack in the wagon below. "You brought a death sentence to my ranch," he said, his voice hard. "I didn't have a choice," May replied, her voice cracking just a fraction. "I needed to get out. I needed a place no one would look. A rancher looking for a wife. It was the perfect cover." She looked down at her hands. "I didn't know you'd be—" She trailed off. "Decent? Capable?" Colt finished for her. "I didn't know you'd be worth saving." The words hung in the air. He hadn't meant to say them, but they were true. He stood up, offering her a hand. She hesitated, then took it. Her grip was strong. As he pulled her up, the distance between them collapsed for a second. He smelled the dust and the sweat and the faint trace of lavender soap, a remnant of the woman she might have been. He stepped back, clearing his throat. "We can't stay here. They'll come back with more men. We have to get to the ranch. It's the only place we can defend." The sun was beginning to dip toward the western horizon, painting the sky in bruises of purple and orange by the time they reached the perimeter of Colt's property. The homestead that usually filled him with pride now looked fragile, a wooden island in a sea of danger. The cattle were lowing softly in the distance, unaware that their pasture was about to become a battlefield. Colt didn't drive the wagon up to the front porch. He pulled it into the barn, immediately closing the heavy doors and barring them. "We need to secure the house," he said, his voice all business. "Windows, doors. We need lines of sight." May was already moving, checking the loft, assessing the structural integrity of the walls. She moved through his barn like she owned it, like she had been fighting sieges her whole life. They walked to the main house together, the space between them charged with a new kind of energy. It wasn't romance, not yet. It was the bond of the foxhole. Inside, the house was cool and dark. Colt lit a kerosene lamp, the yellow light illuminating the simple furniture, the empty table where he had imagined eating breakfast with Emily. May saw the look on his face. "I'm sorry," she said softly. "About Emily, about the lie." Colt looked at her, the shadows dancing across his face. He took off his hat and ran a hand through his hair. "Emily isn't here, May. You are. And right now, that's the only thing that matters." He walked to the gun cabinet, unlocking it and pulling out a repeater rifle and a box of ammunition. He tossed them onto the table. "Can you use a Winchester?" May picked it up, checking the action with a fluid snap. "I can use anything that fires." Colt walked to the window, peering out through the slit in the curtains. The twilight was deepening, turning the scrub brush into monsters. He knew the syndicate. He knew how they operated. They wouldn't just send riders next time. They would send fire. They would send an army. "They'll wait for nightfall," Colt said. "They want the evidence, but they'll settle for our bodies." He turned back to May. She had taken off her hat, her black hair falling loose around her shoulders, framing a face that was fierce and terrified and beautiful all at once. "Why did you keep the books?" he asked. "You could have just run." May met his gaze, her chin lifting. "Because it was right. Because they hurt people. And because I was tired of running." Colt nodded slowly. He understood that. He had spent years running from his own ghosts before building this place. "Well," he said, levering around into his own rifle, "you're done running now. This is my land, and nobody takes what's mine." The declaration hung between them, heavy with a double meaning neither was ready to acknowledge. Outside, the first coyote howled, but it sounded too much like a signal. The siege had begun. The darkness outside was absolute, a heavy velvet curtain that smothered the starlight and hid the predators waiting in the brush. Inside the ranch house the air was stale, thick with the smell of gun oil and the sharp, metallic tang of anticipation. Colt had extinguished the kerosene lamp, plunging the room into shadow, relying on the faint moonlight filtering through the cracks in the boarded windows to navigate his own home. He sat near the front door, his back pressed against the rough timber wall, the Winchester resting across his knees like a sacred relic. Across the room, crouched by the rear window, May was a silhouette of tension. She hadn't moved in 20 minutes. The silence was louder than the gunfire had been, a buzzing pressure in Colt's ears that made his skin crawl. He watched the outline of her black cowboy hat, the way her shoulders rose and fell with controlled, shallow breaths. She was terrified. He knew that, but she buried it under layers of cold calculation that he recognized all too well. It was the armor of someone who had been forced to grow up too fast, too hard. "They're taking too long," May whispered, her voice barely carrying across the floorboards. It wasn't a complaint. It was a tactical observation. Colt shifted his weight, wincing as a floorboard creaked beneath his boot. "They're testing us," he replied, his voice a low rumble. "Waiting for us to get tired, waiting for a mistake. They know we have the high ground in here, but they have the numbers. They'll try to flush us out with smoke or fire before they risk coming through the door." He saw May turn her head toward him in the dark. "If they burn the house," she started, then stopped. "If they burn the house, we go to the root cellar," Colt finished. "But I built this place with green timber and stone. It won't go up like a matchbox. We have time." He wanted to reassure her, but he also wanted her to know the reality. He wasn't going to lie to her. Not now. Suddenly, the night air was split by a sound that wasn't a gunshot. It was the shattering of glass. A bottle, stuffed with a rag and lit with flame, sailed through the upper pane of the side window, crashing against the far wall. The room erupted in orange light as the kerosene-soaked rag ignited the curtains. "Fire!" Colt shouted, scrambling to his feet. He abandoned his post, rushing toward the flames, ripping the drapes down with his bare hands and stomping on them with his heavy boots. The fire hissed and spat, scorching the wood floor, but he smothered it before it could climb the walls. In the sudden illumination, he saw May standing in the center of the room, her revolvers drawn, spinning toward the broken window. She didn't look at the fire. She looked for the target. A shadow moved outside the frame. Bang! May fired, the recoil jolting her slight frame. A cry of pain echoed from the darkness outside, followed by a curse. "One less," she said grimly, the orange glow of the smoldering curtains illuminating the fierce set of her jaw. But as the darkness rushed back in, the sound of heavy boots on the porch steps thundered like a drum. The probe was over. The assault had begun. The front door exploded inward with a deafening crash, the heavy oak splintering under the force of a battering ram. Colt threw himself behind the overturned heavy oak table he had positioned earlier, the wood instantly peppering with lead as three men stormed the threshold, muzzle flashes lighting up the entryway like a strobe light. "Suppressing fire!" Colt roared, levering his Winchester and firing blindly into the doorway. The roar of the rifle in the enclosed space was deafening, a physical blow to the eardrums. He saw one man drop, clutching his thigh, but the other two fanned out, diving for cover behind the sofa and the hallway arch. The sanctity of his home was gone. It was a kill box now. Dust and plaster rained down from the ceiling as bullets chewed through the walls. Colt risked a glance toward the kitchen. May was gone. Panic flared in his chest, cold and sharp, before he heard the distinct, rhythmic boom of her revolver from the shadows of the pantry. She had flanked them. "Give it up, Colt!" a voice bellowed from behind the sofa. It was a rough, gravelly voice, dripping with arrogance. "We don't want you. We want the girl in the book. Send her out, and you keep your land." Colt ejected a spent casing, the hot brass pinging off the floor. "You're trespassing, Pike," Colt shouted back, recognizing the voice of the syndicate's lead enforcer. "And you owe me a new door." He signaled to May in the darkness, a quick hand motion toward the left flank. She caught it, nodding once. The trust between them was instant, born of necessity. She didn't hesitate. As Colt unleashed a rapid volley of 3 shots to pin Pike down, May broke from her cover, sliding across the floor in a baseball slide, firing upward as she moved. Her bullet caught the second gunman in the shoulder, spinning him around. He fired wildly as he fell, a stray round tearing through the fleshy part of Colt's upper arm. Colt grunted, a sharp hiss of pain escaping his teeth as the impact spun him around. He slumped against the wall, clutching his bicep, feeling the warm slickness of blood immediately soaking his shirt. "Colt!" May screamed, her voice losing its tactical calm for the first time. She scrambled toward him, abandoning her position, firing 2 shots to keep Pike's head down. She reached him, her hands checking the wound with frantic energy. "I'm fine," he wheezed, though the room was spinning slightly. "Just a graze. Watch the door." But Pike had realized the shift in momentum. He stood up from behind the sofa, a shotgun leveled at them. "Touching," Pike sneered, his silhouette looming large in the smoky haze. "Truly. Now drop the—" His speech was cut short as the kitchen window behind him shattered, not from the outside, but from the impact of a heavy cast-iron skillet Colt had knocked off the counter earlier. No, it was a diversion. May had kicked a chair. Pike flinched, turning his head for a fraction of a second. In that micro-moment, Colt raised his pistol with his good hand. The shot took Pike in the chest, sending him crashing backward over the coffee table. Silence crashed back into the room, heavy and ringing. The aftermath of the violence was a strange, suspended reality. The air was thick with the acrid smell of gunpowder, sulfur, and the metallic scent of blood. The only sound was the wind whistling through the broken door and the ragged breathing of 2 people who had just stared death in the face. Colt slid down the wall until he was sitting on the floor, his head resting back against the plaster. His arm throbbed with a dull, rhythmic ache, but the bleeding had slowed. May was on her knees beside him, her black pants stained with dust and ash. She wasn't looking at the door anymore. She was looking at him, her dark eyes wide and searching. She holstered her weapon with a trembling hand and reached into her pocket, pulling out a handkerchief. Without asking, she pressed it against his wound, her touch firm but surprisingly gentle. "You're an idiot," she whispered, her voice shaking. "You took a bullet for a stranger." Colt looked at her, really seeing her in the dim light. The adrenaline was fading, leaving behind a raw, exposed vulnerability. "You're not a stranger, May," he said, his voice raspy. "Not anymore." He watched as she tied the makeshift bandage, her fingers deft and careful. The intimacy of the moment was overwhelming. Here, in the wreckage of his living room, with dead men on the floor and the night still hiding more threats, the distance between them evaporated. She paused, her hand lingering on his arm. "I never wanted this," she confessed, her eyes glistening. "I just wanted to stop them. I didn't want to drag good people down with me." Colt reached out, covering her hand with his own rough, calloused palm. "You didn't drag me anywhere I wasn't already standing," he said. "A man doesn't hold on to a place like this without fighting for it eventually. You just gave the fight a name." May looked up, meeting his gaze. The tough outlaw exterior cracked, revealing the exhausted woman underneath. "Why?" she asked simply. "Why fight for me? You could have handed me over. Pike offered you a deal." Colt offered a wry, pained smile. "I don't make deals with snakes. And besides," he added, his voice dropping lower, "I was waiting for a partner, someone who could handle the storms. Emily, she would have hidden in the cellar. You slid across the floor and flanked them." He leaned his head back, closing his eyes for a second. "I think fate sent the wrong ticket, but the right woman." The air between them charged with a sudden, palpable electricity. May leaned in, her forehead resting against his shoulder for just a moment, a gesture of immense trust. "We aren't done yet," she whispered into his shirt. "Pike was just the foreman. The rest of them, they'll burn the barn next. That's where the horses are." Colt's eyes snapped open. The horses. If they lost the horses, they were trapped in the desert. The tender moment shattered, replaced by the cold clarity of survival. "The dynamite," Colt said, struggling to get to his feet, wincing as his arm protested. "In the shed out back. I have a crate I use for clearing stumps." He looked at May, his face grim. "If they want a war, let's give them a finale." May stood up, adjusting her hat, the warrior mask slipping back into place, though her eyes remained soft when they looked at him. "How do we get to the shed without being cut down?" she asked. Colt moved to the back door, peering out into the darkness. "We don't go to the shed. The shed is connected to the corral fence. If I can get to the roof, I can drop a stick right into their staging area. It was a suicide run, or close to it." May grabbed his good arm. "No, you can't climb with that arm. I go." Colt opened his mouth to argue, but the look in her eyes stopped him. It wasn't a request. "You cover me from the upper window," she commanded. "You're the better shot with the rifle. I'm the one who can move fast." They moved with the synchronized precision of a team that had been working together for years, not hours. Colt climbed the stairs, the pain in his arm a dull roar that focused his mind. He took up a position at the bedroom window, the one that overlooked the backyard and the corral. Below, he saw shadows moving near the barn, men carrying torches, preparing to flush them out or burn their escape route. He lined up his sights. Meanwhile, May slipped out the back door, a shadow moving within shadows. She wore the night like a cloak. Colt watched her dash from the rain barrel to the woodpile, her movements silent. He held his fire, waiting. If he shot now, he'd give away her position. He had to trust her. She reached the tool shed, disappearing inside for a heart-stopping 10 seconds. When she emerged, she held a bundle of red sticks. Dynamite. She didn't have a fuse. She had a plan. She scrambled up the trellis on the side of the barn, agile as a cat, hauling herself onto the roof. The men below were shouting now, torchlight flickering against the wood. They were getting ready to throw. Colt saw one man step forward, arm cocked back to toss a torch into the hayloft. Crack. Colt fired. The man dropped the torch and spun away, clutching his shoulder. The element of surprise was blown. "Cover fire!" someone yelled from below. Bullets began to chew up the siding around Colt's window. He ducked, levering the rifle and popping up to fire again. He had to keep their heads down. He had to buy her time. On the roof, May lit the short fuse with a strike-anywhere match she struck on her boot heel. The spark flared bright in the darkness, a beacon that drew every eye. "Hey, boys," she shouted, her voice echoing over the yard. "Catch!" She hurled the bundle with perfect aim right into the center of the cluster of men by the corral gate. She didn't wait to see it land. She rolled backward, sliding down the opposite slope of the roof just as the world turned white. The explosion was a concussive thump that shook the house to its foundations. Dirt, wood, and debris rained down from the sky. The screams of the horses were drowned out by the sheer force of the blast. Colt was thrown back from the window, dust filling his lungs. He scrambled back up, peering through the smoke. The corral gate was gone. The men were scattered, stunned, or retreating into the darkness. The threat wasn't just suppressed, it was shattered. The surviving mercenaries were running, their morale broken by the sudden escalation of force. Silence returned to the ranch, but this time it was the silence of victory. 3 months later, the scent of burning wood was no longer a sign of danger, but the comforting smell of the hearth. The autumn air was crisp, turning the cottonwoods along the creek into brilliant explosions of gold. The ranch house still bore the scars of the siege, a patched door, fresh mismatched timber on the siding, but it stood strong. Colt stood on the porch, a hammer in his hand, finishing the repair on the railing. His arm had healed, leaving a jagged scar that pulled slightly when the weather turned cold, a permanent reminder of the night the world changed. He paused, looking out over the pasture where the cattle grazed peacefully, their breath misting in the morning chill. The fear that had once defined his isolation was gone, replaced by a deep, grounded sense of purpose. The screen door creaked open behind him. He didn't turn. He knew the sound of those boots. May stepped out, holding 2 mugs of steaming coffee. She wasn't wearing all black anymore. She wore a heavy canvas work coat over a blue flannel shirt, though the gun belt was still strapped to her hip. Old habits and necessary precautions died hard, but the tension in her shoulders was gone. She handed him a mug, leaning against the railing beside him. "Marshall sent a wire," she said, her voice calm. "The testimony held up. The governor signed the indictments this morning. The syndicate is being dismantled." Colt took a sip of the coffee, the warmth spreading through his chest. "So, the accountant is officially retired?" he asked, a hint of a smile playing on his lips. May looked out at the horizon, the same horizon she had once scanned for enemies. Now, she just saw the land. "Retired," she agreed. "I think I'm better suited for management anyway. Someone has to keep this place profitable if you're going to keep spending money on premium lumber." She nudged his arm with her elbow, a playful gesture that felt entirely natural. Colt chuckled, the sound deep and genuine. He turned to face her, resting his hand on the railing, boxing her in gently. "It's a lot of work," he warned, though his eyes were warm. "Running a place like this, hard winters, dry summers, no days off." "I'm not afraid of work, Colt," May said, looking up at him. The morning sun caught the sharp angles of her face, softening them. "And I'm not afraid of this place. I stopped running the night I got off that train." She reached up, adjusting his collar, her fingers lingering for a moment. "I told you. You got the partner you needed." Colt set his coffee down on the railing and took her hand, his thumb tracing the knuckles that had held a gun so steady when it mattered. "Yeah," he said softly, the truth of it settling in his chest like a stone in a riverbed, solid, immovable. "I did." He looked past her, at the road leading into town. It was empty. No dust, no riders. Just the open, quiet country. "Let's get to work," he said, and together they turned back toward the house, walking through the door not as survivors, but as builders of a life they had carved out of the fire.